Hello, I'm Dr. Ioannis Kokkinidis of the Fresno chapter, and welcome to the sixth, I think, Golden lecture of the AHEPA District 21 Golden Gate series. Our speaker today is Gonda Van Steen. Gonda Van Steen holds the Koraes Chair in the Center for Hellenic Studies in the Department of Classics at King's College London. She is the author of 5 books: Venom in the Verse, Aristophanes in Modern Greece, Liberating Hellenism from the Ottoman Empire, Theatre of the Condemned, Classical Tragedy on Greek Prison Islands, and Stage of Emergency Theatre and Public Performance on the Greek Military Dictatorship 1967-1974. Her latest book, Adoption, Memory in Cold War Greece, takes the reader into the new uncharted terrain of Greek adoption histories and stories that become paradigmatic Cold War politics and history. The subject of today's talk is Greek children of the silent migration, the AHEPA's role in the U.S. adoption from Greece in the 1950s, 1960s. AHEPA is the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, founded almost a century ago by several Greek restaurant owners in Atlanta who were tired of getting their restaurants bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. So with that, I'll mute myself and give the floor to our speaker.
Well, thank you, Ioannis, and also many thanks to Alex and Vasilis, who have been, the three of you have been the pillars to make this work. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, and it's actually my first time I talk to an AHEPA audience. That makes it all the more special on this Saturday afternoon that we can spend together. So it is really special because the AHEPA played an important role in these adoptions from Greece after the war years, and it's a role that is not well known enough, but it's a role that I've been able to research for the past 10 years. This research has been with me since about 2012, dare I say. So we're coming up on 10 years, and it's ongoing. On an average day, like today, I get an email from somebody I don't know. Like this morning when I got an email from a young woman whose mother was adopted from Greece, and both the young woman and her mother want to know more. So this is clearly a topic that is on many people's minds and that has actually never left the mind of those who are adopted. So then I call this a silent migration of children from Greece to the US. And silent is important because the truth is we don't know much about this movement. If you consult the history books, there is absolutely nothing written about it. Absolutely nothing. The only way people have heard about it is through some reality TV shows in Greece called Pama Paketo. And there they get, you know, one family circumstances, and by the end of the show it's either resolved and everybody's in tears. And we understand it as a family story, but we don't understand it by way of the show as some sort of a big chapter of Greek history. We only see individual circumstances and we never see the bigger picture. So my effort is then to kind of deliver the bigger picture and help us understand this migration of children for adoption in a bigger historical context. So I don't need to repeat for Greeks just how devastating the war years were in Greece, right? And the 1940s, the German occupation, very bad, immediately followed by the Civil War, equally disastrous, lots of division, lots of people killed, exiled, imprisoned, you name it. The 1940s is almost like a complete standstill. When you study population growth, the population hardly rises in the course of 10 years. That tells you just how many people didn't survive that decade. And then when we come out of the Civil War, we know of 2 campaigns that have to do with children. And it's those 2 campaigns that I won't be talking about because they're better known. In fact, the whole history of the occupation and the Civil War, and then also the pedomazoma and the pedopolis of Frederiki, all of that has been covered by way of books, by credible historians and also by opinions, but that's the chunk that has been covered. What has not been covered is the third children's movement, the migration of children for adoption to the US. That's kind of in the bigger picture of what happens to children. In the, around 1950, that has always been the missing link. That's the part we don't know about. And so that's how I got interested. And the way this topic came to me is, as you can tell from my books, I was doing other things. And then one day I get an email from somebody who tells me that both his mother and his aunt are adopted from Greece. And can I please help him understand this a little bit better? And that's how I got started. Basically out of curiosity myself. Now I want you to take a little test afterwards. You go on Google and you type in illegal Greek adoptions, and I can tell you all hell breaks loose. And that's exactly what I did. And then you think, wait a minute, is there just a lot of smoke and no fire, or is there smoke and some fire? Or so I felt, okay, clearly something is going on, and the only way to approach it is to do a systematic study of it, which wasn't easy, but here we are. Okay, so it's important that I answer your questions of how many children are involved, how did this happen, when did it happen, who were the mediators, where do these children come from, and where are these children going. And of course, I call them children, but today these people are in their, let's say in their 60s, the majority of them, and they're with us as adults, right, as older adults. So then, it's important to separate out two movements. First of all, the movement goes from Greece to the US, and the key dates there are those 12 years from 1950 to roughly 1962, during which 3,200 children go for adoption from Greece to the US. That's a lot. That's 3,200 children we did not know about, because the numbers have never been established. In fact, Greece itself does not know how many there are because they didn't keep track. So that means that if we can't count them as they leave Greece, my only way to establish the number were to try to count them as they arrive in the US. And that's how I get to the number of 3,200. And I check it and cross-check it, and I must say it's the best number we can come up with. It checks out as I cross-check it left and right. So 3,200, they come from orphanages all over Greece, but I have to be precise, and these orphanages are typically institutions for younger children. They're not necessarily the pedopolis or the orphanotrophia, they're the vrefocomia, so for younger children, in the majority now. And then, of course, there are also many families who have lost the father of the household, or the father has lost his wife. So families in distress are also families that let some of their children or all of their children go for adoption to the US. This movement from Greece to the US changes dramatically in the early 1960s. Around 1962, more children keep coming to the US, but by then exclusively to Greek American families. So there's a continuing trickle, but it really tapers off around 1962. And then that movement of adoption takes another direction, and the second biggest taker of children from Greece are the Netherlands, which is a big surprise to me. I did not expect that going in. 600 children between the early 1960s and 1975 are placed for adoption with Dutch families in the Netherlands. Now, given that the Netherlands is a small country, this is a big number. And mind you, these children are, of course, adults today, yet again. They're mostly in their 50s, and of course they speak Dutch, and it's kind of a lucky coincidence that I speak Dutch too, and so clearly I kind of included them in my study because the circumstances were just so right, and I feel you can't separate out the movements. Now, the children then who go to the Netherlands have one thing in common, that they tend to come from the Kinderofrefon Mitera in Athens, but it has branches in Kerkyra and on the island of Crete. So they kind of go to the Netherlands in a more centralized way, whereas the ones who go to the US in kind of different waves, and in a more scattered kind of way. You can't pin them down to just one institution. And you can see that throughout my slide presentation, and it's about a dozen slides, I've actually illustrated my presentation with pictures that are provided by these people themselves. And I find that very special because they've saved whatever they can, and an increasing number of them has started to write their own story. So what you're looking at here is the story by one of these adoptees with roots in the peninsula, in one of these fingers of the northern peninsula around Chalkidiki, but in this case the peninsula of Mount Athos, in a town called Ouranoupoli. And you see that the typical Byzantine tower that sits in the harbor of Ouranoupoli is also the one she placed on the cover. This is a 9-year-old girl that was sent from Ouranoupoli to Los Angeles for adoption and who's written her story. So then, we need to kind of parcel out the ways in which this happened. And that is kind of important because the history of it in the 12 years that children go from Greece to America, the history changes very quickly. And there is kind of a big landmark date that separates a before and an after. And that landmark date is 1953, the American Refugee Relief Act, which comes into being to alleviate the many, many stateless people and refugees, the displaced persons, let's say, that are still in miserable conditions all across Europe, in countries that were very badly afflicted by the Second World War and its aftermath. So that's kind of the critical date. And children will become part of that refugee movement. So then there is the before 1953. In a first wave, about 1,000 children of those total of 3,200 come from Greece to America. And they're mainly older children and truly orphaned children, by which I mean that these are the children that were born typically in the 1940s, that have lost a parent or parents due to the war or the Civil War, and that have, let's say, a distant uncle in Chicago that they can go and join as soon as that uncle asks for them and promise to sponsor them. So they go to relatives or distant relatives. So it's almost like an adoption that overlaps with the family migration movement. And they're typically a little older. So what would happen is, let's say, 3 children of a family that has lost their parents go to their uncle in Chicago, who has a restaurant, and 2 are very small, and the uncle adopts them, formally adopts them, and the older one does some sort of an apprenticeship in the restaurant. The uncle serves as a guardian, and soon enough he will be standing on his own feet while keeping an eye on his younger siblings. That's very typical. That's very typical. So this is a first wave of about 1,000 children that are basically overlapping with what you would call immigrants through circumstances or refugees. And here is the first important role that the AHEPA plays. If you look at any institution around 1950 that has any experience dealing with this, it's got to be the AHEPA, right? After all, they've tried to facilitate immigration from Greece and acculturation as soon as people come from Greece ever since they were founded in 1922. Around 1950, there is no equivalent organization with chapters in very many places that can be some sort of an immediate, dare I say, welcoming committee and support group for these rather occasionally traumatized young people who come over from Greece. So it's not just a family effort, it's also an AHEPA effort, a Greek community effort. So these first 1,000 then, of the total of 3,200 children, typically go to a Greek American context, community, and find a lot of support there. And you can already kind of see that they quickly kind of outgrow their childhood years, and they will become working forces of the 1950s. Because most of these children were actually truly orphaned, they are not the ones who search for their roots. After all, there's typically an older sibling or an uncle or an aunt that knows what happens in Greece, and they know the often traumatic history of their family, and so there is no need to go in search of the family because they know their history. That's very different from what we will soon see, which is the second wave in this movement. And those are the children that come in after 1953. And these are the first children of what we call stranger adoptions. They go to parents who are strangers to them, and the children themselves are strangers to the couple that will adopt them, right? It's a little bit how we perceive of adoption today when you take in, let's say, for instance, a Chinese child. You don't know that child, you're just familiarized with that child as a part of the adoption process. And so something dramatically changes in 1953 because of that new law, the Refugee Relief Act. Many more, they still call them orphans, but they're not always orphans. Many more children can go to the US, and some go to Greek Americans, but a whole lot of them go to just about any American family. And I mean just about any. And very often that is, lots of children go to big cities because there's a lot of demand. They go to military families because military families move around and are more, let's say, open to adopting a foreign child since they've already traveled through various places in Europe and familiarized themselves with other cultures. They don't see it as such a big leap to take in a child from another culture. And then also these children are already a little younger, as you can tell. So if the child there, the older girl, is 8 years old, that's already on the old side now. The younger ones are more like 3 or 4 years old. And again, the AHEPA plays a major role here to facilitate this. Because now they got the hang of it, right? They've already worked on that first wave of refugees, and now the kind of AHEPA activity switches and becomes a matter of really handling adoptions as we know them today. Not family unification or reunification, but adoptions as we understand, international adoptions as we understand them today. So I have to give the AHEPA credit to kind of pretty much invent the wheel of post-war international adoption. And I have to say this happens, and the AHEPA does this, and I actually doubt if the AHEPA knows this. They do this before lots of Korean children start arriving in the US. So in a way, the AHEPA is kind of ahead of the curve. And so these children now travel by plane. In the beginning it was boats, now they travel by plane. Their parents are so eager to get them, they pay money for this. These children can't arrive in the US quickly enough, they travel by plane. And you can see that these airlines kind of make an opportunity out of it to advertise themselves. We all remember TWA. Here is TWA carrying 4 orphans from Greece. Mind you, they still call them orphans, and orphans kind of does a lot of work for the mentality in which this happens. People are thinking that they're doing a good deed by taking in children from Greece. But, and I have to say a but here, that orphans kind of sticks. And in 1962 and in 1964, they still call them war orphans, whereas clearly a child born in 1959 is not a war orphan. And when the child is born in 1964, it's more likely that its young mother is a war orphan, but not the child itself. So you can see that you ended in some sort of a rationale that is about saving children, but it's really about adoption. It's not about saving orphans anymore. We've left kind of that phase behind. Now, the most active member between AHEPA member between 1953 and 1956 is a lawyer from Indiana called Leo Lamberson, and he's Greek, Leonidas, and then he Americanized his name. And he is made the chair of the AHEPA Refugee Relief Committee, and he understands that it's not just that it's actually much, much more productive. It gives the AHEPA a much dare I say, much more prestige to be placing orphans, adoptees, rather than adult refugees. And you can also at this time get non-quota visa for children in the way that you don't get them for adults. So all of a sudden, Lambertson starts kind of specializing in adoptions from Greece. And he advertises that widely via the AHEPA networks, and remember the periodical The AHEPA, and they look for sponsors. And to make this all a little bit easier, because people are a little bit afraid of the paperwork, the AHEPA promises that if people adopt via the AHEPA will kind of clear the path by providing what we call blanket assurances. So instead of all these people having to kind of, discover the procedure on their own, the AHEPA kind of channels things, and things can go faster if you have the AHEPA stamp of approval. And either you are an AHEPA, or you get some friends who is in the AHEPA to kind of put in a good word for you. So the AHEPA is kind of trying to fast track these adoptions, even though it has to be said they never have any kind of special education in child care or child welfare, but they see it as a way to bring over children fairly quickly, fairly smoothly, and they do it without the parents having to travel to Greece. They do it by proxy, meaning the parents don't have to show up in the court in Athens. The AHEPA designated lawyer in Athens will do it for them. And the AHEPA will then vouch for the fact that this is a married couple, a stable household that can financially support the child, good community members, you name it. Whether you're Greek or not, there are enough people who find an AHEPA member to state just that and get the adoption through that way. Now, clearly, by let's say 1955, 1956, when this is blossoming, clearly this is a booming business. Because what happens is, these are the baby boom years, and the Americans feel a huge need to raise children again. There's almost a stigma attached to being childless. It's the Cold War, there's the fear of communism. The patriotic thing to do is to raise a stable family. So if you can't have children, you feel like you're kind of not pulling your weight in society. So adoptions are very popular, and the demand keeps climbing because people want to be raising children in kind of a conservative model of a household. And so Lambertson catches on rather quickly, and here is where it gets a little off the rails. And I have to be honest with you about that. In the beginning, what he charges for an adoption, for the fees, is $500, which by the mid-50s is money, but it's not a huge amount. Give it another 2 years, and the price has gone up to $2,500 or $3,000. So all of a sudden, you kind of see that Lambertson saw a business opportunity, and people start complaining. And forgive me when I say it, the Greeks, when they get vocal, they speak their mind. So they start complaining. The AHEPA starts receiving all these letters of dissatisfaction. They ask Lambertson for explanations. They want him to show the books. He refuses. So by the end of 1956, this comes crumbling down, and the AHEPA decides that too many complaints, too much lack of transparency. The members won't stand for it. It's not a good thing that Lambertson kind of took advantage of his position. He is ousted. And you kind of think that things will stop there, but they don't. There is a whole new phase that we enter into in 1957. And then what happens is, instead now of the AHEPA placing children for adoption from Greece, in a way they kind of make it an operation of a few people only who kind of are in the know and work with each other. So the people who then start to work together without really being very clear to the membership are Lambertson again, Stephen Skopas, who's soon going to be a New York judge, and then the Greek lawyer who's still the same designated lawyer who will do the paperwork in Athens. And they keep responding to this growing and growing demand. And the demand is so high that they actually feel, wait a minute, we need to start cultivating some special contacts in Greece because we cannot address the demand quickly enough. And so they focus on the Vrefocomio, the foundling home, the orphanage of Patras. For some reason, they find a good partnership with Patras. And what that means today is that nearly, there are saying 90% of all the adoptees brought over by the AHEPA, which are very many, come from Patras, which is kind of a little disproportionate. You would expect Athens or you would expect Thessaloniki, but no, they come from Patras, and that means if they ended up in the foundling home of Patras, that means their origins, if we know them, are Patras and everything around it, right? Reaching as far as Lefkada, inland, you name it. But Patras becomes kind of the hotspot of these adoptions because that's where the AHEPA gets preferential treatment, and if Patras has children available for adoption, it makes sure it gives them to the AHEPA. Now the AHEPA has to promise to make sure that they continue to do this, that these children will go to Greek Americans. And indeed there is quite a demand among Greek Americans, but they don't. In practice that's not what works. In practice they give children to anybody who can pay the fee, and anybody who can put in a proper application. So the AHEPA promises one thing to the Greek state, but in practice it kind of shakes out a little differently. And again, the complaints keep coming in, and now the Greek Americans are really upset because they feel that at least the AHEPA, should show some loyalty to them rather than favoring just about any Americans. So they get a little upset. The complaints again come in, and in May of 1959, this explodes into a scandal where Stephen Skopas is actually investigated in the New York courts. I'll get to that in a minute, but you could kind of see it building again. For a moment, though, I want to dwell on why Greek children and why are Greek children so much in demand. And for that, I need to tell you a little bit more about the American climate, the context of back in the day. I had already spoken of the baby boom. But this is, after all, 1950, this is the Cold War, and there is a huge fear of communists coming in these various refugee dispensations. But the best part about children is that they are not ideologically colored. The safest immigrants to let in and kind of reinvigorate the US with new blood are children, because they come in as blank slates, is the theory, right? So there is that Cold War anti-communist climate, McCarthyism, you know it, that kind of favors children coming in. And soon enough, as soon as these children arrive and they're adopted, they need to only wait like 2 years in most states, it depends on the state, to then be applicable, eligible to US citizenship. And parents take care of that they really also do that. Only a few children fall through the cracks, but it is important to get the citizenship. And then on such occasions, you can see that the smallest naturalized immigrants get all the media attention. So it's no surprise to us that these kids make the newspaper as they pledge allegiance to the American state. In the meantime, though, Americans are not your average American is not very well educated about Greece. I told you that they continue to think that there is still war raging in Greece, whereas that's really not the case. So they really don't understand actually just how and where they get the children from, because everything happens with them staying home, seeing pictures, and everything is done by way of lawyers and proxies in the big cities in Greece. So I also want to give you a little bit of a comparison of numbers, because it's important to kind of understand the scale of this phenomenon, and also a little bit of my astonishment that for such a large phenomenon, it has never really been measured in its proper proportions. Between 1948 and 1962, the adopted children from Greece to the US are 3,200 total in number. If you compare that with the children from Korea, and South Korea then, then you see that the South Korean children arriving in the US are about 1,000 more. So our first inclination is to say, oh, look, the numbers from Korea are so much higher. But here's the catch. Korea has 4 times the population of Greece at this point. 4 times. So that means if you kind of parcel it out proportionally, that means that a disproportionate large number of Greek children go to the US. And in the meantime, our picture of international adoption, we kind of tend to think that the Korean children were the first, but no, the children from Greece have already been coming for 5 years before the first Koreans start arriving. So here I'm back to my claim that actually the Greeks provided the blueprint of how to do this with the occasional pitfalls that are kind of inevitable. So why are Greek children so much in demand then? Well, you know, the answer is straightforward, and it's a very 1950s answer. This is still a society in which the civil rights movement has not yet happened. Greek children are white, and so for all, you know, parents, adoptive parents who have some hesitation about bringing in a child that is clearly, visibly from another ethnicity, Greek children are the solution because they blend right in the same way that Korean children do not. It's a simple fact, but it's also a very important factor. And add to that then, that there is always, you know, Greece as an ancient culture. The pictures promote that. Here is Danny Kaye on the Acropolis. In other pictures, you see Marlon Brando holding Greek orphans. Jane Russell, the actress, gets in the game as well. So all of a sudden, you see the phenomenon developing of celebrity adoptions. That doesn't mean that they necessarily adopt a Greek child. It means that they kind of bring their attention to the cause of the Greek children. This picture couldn't capture it any better. You get Danny Kaye, you get these nice little Greek orphans, and the background is the Acropolis. So you can see that all these factors kind of conspire together, right? So we need to talk then a little bit about the agencies and the mediators, about the AHEPA and the others who are in this adoption business along with the AHEPA. So the AHEPA took care of the early phases and goes strong until about 1955 with all the turmoil around Lamberson in 1956, and then the individuals, Lamberson, Skopas, and the lawyer Renatus, pick it up again in 1956 through 58 and turn it kind of into a black market, it needs to be said, for personal gain. At this moment, the AHEPA members are not kept in the loop, and they are furious about it when the scandal breaks around Skopas, the Skopas scandal, in May of 1959, at which time Skopas is arrested. He's brought, grand jury investigations are being held. He was, of course, also a New York City judge, so he's very prominent. He needs to resign. The grand jury investigation brings about 30 people who've adopted through Skopas into court to question them. These parents are terrified, right? You can imagine, you've just had your child for a month, and here you find out that the mediator is accused of child trafficking. They're terribly afraid of losing their child. The courts actually have to promise that if parents cooperate, they will not lose their child. Otherwise, they will not have anybody, I think, to testify. And so this just a huge outcry of this. This reverberates in Greece. I mean, it all takes a very bad name, and it takes months for this kind of scandal to die down. And then the scandal kind of completely implodes because Skopas and everybody else is acquitted. A huge surprise, because the testimonies in court speak of some pretty obscure money business, tax evasion, cutting corners. It's all there in 300 pages. But the court in New York faces a very basic problem. The adoptions were handled in Greece, and because the adoptions were good enough for Greece, legal enough for Greece, the American state actually has its hands tied. You cannot undo an adoption that was good enough for the home country if there are no red flags. And they judge that the red flags are not important enough. And we call this, for the lawyers among you, you will know this, we call this the principle of reciprocity or comity. It would be as if, let's say, you got married in Greece, that was good enough for Greece, the US state has no right to unravel your legal marriage unless there is, you know, there are massive numbers of, let's say, illegal marriages coming out of Greece. So, on the principle of reciprocity, the American state has to consider legal what Greece judged legal, which makes the whole court case implode, and Skopas comes out a free man. But he's really shaken by the experience, and he never goes back to adoptions. In fact, it stops there. And because he leaves a vacuum, other people step in. And there's competition at this point, so people step in, and one of the people one of the mediators who step in are a brother and sister pair, Maurice and Rebecca Issacher, who kind of, now that they know that the state in the US doesn't consider it illegal, they actually perfect the system of what you would call mail-order babies. Dare I say, even with less scruples, because the court has already said that what is legal in Greece has to pass. And then some people go in it kind of on their own. There is a priest in Texas, for instance, by the name of Father Diavatis, who between 56 and 62 single-handedly places about 80 to 90 children for adoption around San Antonio, where he has his Greek church, and surroundings. And many more went to non-Greek Americans than went to Greek Americans. And then also the Greek church and the Greek Welfare Society, PIPA, which is actually overseen by Queen Frederica, they try to kind of, dare I say, centralize this, organize this on a Greek basis rather than with a home base in the US, but they never really quite get their act together. They're kind of a little too late in the game. And clearly other people have already rolled out the procedure and don't catch up. And they don't catch up. There is, however, one venue in the works, which is the International Social Service, which is the biggest competitor of the AHEPA. And they constantly attack each other. You know, the AHEPA attacks the ISS saying they work too slowly. The ISS attacks the AHEPA saying they cut corners. But overall, the International Social Service is arguing for better procedures, and especially to get rid of those adoptions by proxy, whereby the parents don't even have to make an appearance in court in Greece. And they also feel that you have to have a proper home study. You have to have a proper investigation of the home in which the child will be arriving. And even, if possible, a period of probation to see if you know, the child and the new parents will bond. None of those procedures, even though they exist in the mid-50s, they're not new procedures, even though they exist, none of those procedures, however, is implemented by the AHEPA. The AHEPA and the Issachers and Father Diavatis have understood that if people want a child, they want it as quickly as possible. Now, that's nice for the customer, if I dare say, but that's not necessarily a guarantee of a good adoption. In fact, a whole lot of things went wrong just because of that. And then there are some smaller players in the game, including travel agents and people who really know nothing about child adoption, but there they are. Now, this movement causes quite a lot of reverberation, let's say, in local newspapers all over the US. This is, you know, children arriving from Greece, and very often 2 children, because families were allowed up to 2 children. That makes the newspapers. And so you see everywhere in these tiny, small corners of the US, in tiny local newspapers, you see these stories of these adoptions from Greece. And so, for instance, in Texas, there is this picture, you know, of an Athens orphanage where it's cold and miserable, and these children are going to wonderful new lives. Mind you, this is kind of the fairy tale story, and I already warned you that it isn't always that way. And there's also a huge pressure for these children to become little Americans as quickly as possible. And in Oregon, they say the boy will be a Texan in no time at all. So this idea that The child is a blank slate, and whatever it left behind in Greece will be forgotten, and you can make an Americanarchy out of it very quickly. And then there is always that kind of misinformation about the Civil War, as in the last quote here, the whereabouts of the children's father were unknown. Informed guesses were that he was victimized by the partisan strife that periodically engulfs Greece. But in 1956, these skirmishes of the Civil War are no longer very prominent, but you can see that kind of the narrative about Greece hasn't really changed much. And then, what wins over Greek children when they first arrive? They like every possible gadget, cars, television, vacuum cleaners, and then food. They love food. They love ice cream, pancakes, spaghetti, and so there is a sense that you know, comfort food and comfort products will make these children feel at home as quickly as possible. And the newspapers, of course, emphasize that, right? And they also, and this is a little unpleasant, they also kind of make it look as if children come from filthy conditions to the land, i.e. America, where hygiene is known. Now, anybody who knows Greek Koraes knows that lack of hygiene is not a problem. Far from it. Cleanliness is a much valued virtue in Greece. So the whole depiction of Greece, you know, where there are no baths and no combs and no toothbrush, is in 1959 quite false, but it tells the story in the US. Now, here is another blurb from the Amarillo Globe in Texas in 1960 that should make us a little nervous. This is an adoptive couple speaking, and they say that, you know, we came to the time where we wanted to have children, but we sidestepped child welfare obstacles in the US and tried Europe. A lot of people who adopt have tried to adopt first domestically within the US, were rejected for whatever reason, and then tried Greece and get a child very quickly and very easily. This is, of course, a recipe for disaster. Occasionally that's indeed what happens, because there was really no follow-up, and since these parents weren't present, they were never interviewed, there was no proper checking of what credentials these parents brought to the adoption. The main condition to be able to adopt was your financial situation. So any letter from your bank and you know, a record of the fact that you were employed was good enough to get you a Greek child. You can kind of see that this does not bode well. And sure enough, as much as there are hundreds and hundreds of good stories, there are also stories of adoptions that should never have happened. And I dare say that because the people speak for themselves, right? And so the girl from the tower whom you saw earlier feels that she was very much a victim of family separation. Her mother was a widow. Her mother actually let her go consciously, thinking that she would do well for her child and give her other opportunities, and then it turned out to be rather disastrous. And she found her mother again after 15 years, but she described what a kind of psychological toll it took. There's also a very outspoken book that in its imagery tells you that money was involved, and that there was more money involved than just covering the fees. That's a very unpleasant thing for children to learn, that they're part of some sort of a transaction around children. And there are always a big emphasis on the secrets, everything that wasn't told about your adoption. People were told that their mother had died. The mother was told that the child had died. This causes delays of decades of people not looking for each other. And then when they finally find each other, it turns out to be one big fat lie. So the middle book then is by a Dutch woman, who of course is entirely Greek, and she looks the part, who kind of has been discovering all the lies that kind of were packaged in the story of her adoption. And here is the newest acquisition by a person who teaches at Temple University, actually. And the cover of the book, it's not out yet, but I like to show it to you. The cover of the book shows a letter of his birth mother, which is actually written with a few mistakes there, and on top of it is the print of his official passport that took him out of the country. So I actually find it a very exciting movement that not only is there a book to cover the history, which happens to be mine, but there is also some sort of a new openness for people people have found the courage to write about this themselves, the good and the bad and the ugly. Now, while this is happening, I'm going to close this now so you can. While this is happening, of course, these people are looking for their records, right?
You are no longer sharing your screen.
Okay, that's good because the slide part of the presentation is done. So, but I have a few notes to end on where again the contribution of the AHEPA is vital. These people were adopted with very minimal records. And the AHEPA didn't keep the records. The headquarters did not keep the records. That means occasionally people call up the AHEPA headquarters and people say, we don't know anything of this. We actually don't even know if it happened, and we certainly don't have any paperwork. Clearly, record keeping is important. I actually think that some people may have kept private records, all these people who acted as sponsors for their community. So my appeal is then, if anybody has private records, people, life and death depends on it. People want to know their history. They want to know their medical history. They want to be able to tell their children where they're from. It has been, in most cases, 60 to 70 years, the time to dig up records and to get the records from wherever they are, both in the US and in Greece, has come. And hopefully the AHEPA can kind of put out some national call for records because they are important. The Greek state is normally obliged to give you your records, but it's kind of, it's Greek bureaucracy. It's Greek bureaucracy. And these people don't have Greek. They don't know their way around Greece. It's very hard to get your records, even though legally you're entitled to them. And then there's always the question, how much is there really there, right? So what people do is they take DNA tests left and right. So the commercial DNA has kind of put this in some sort of a whirlwind motion, right? And normally DNA tests should help you, but a lot of Greeks don't take DNA tests because Greeks in Greece know where they come from. They don't need DNA tests. So it's very hard to match with Greek families because the amount of Greek DNA in all these commercial databases is fairly small. So clearly the technology is there, but the volume in the database isn't there. And so there is then also a few more things that these people really want to do. They want to visit Greece, and now that they find they want their medical history. And especially now during an age of vulnerability, as COVID really is, they would like to know the details of their medical history as much as they can reconstruct them, because if you're in your 60s and 70s and you have no answer for the doctor as to what you're carrying, that is of course all the more problematic. And then one last wish is these people would really like to be restored to Greek citizenship. They left as citizens, right? They traveled on Greek passports, and through the adoption, they have lost their citizenship through no fault on their own, of course, because they had never any say in the matter. So they would just really want the Greek government to notice this and to make the path to citizenship easy. After all, the DNA doesn't count, but the DNA shows that they are Greek. What records they have show that they are Greek. Typically, the records come from Patras. It is Greek. They traveled on Greek passport. Even if they were found on a doorstep in Athens, as a foundling, you're still Greek in the place where you're found. But the path to citizenship is long and hard. And again, it should be a collective gesture, perhaps a goodwill gesture on the part of the Greek state, which, after all, cut them off from Greek citizenship by giving them out. And would be a very nice collective gesture to welcome these people back in by way of giving them Greek citizenship if they want as a dual citizenship. So that's kind of what I'm hoping will resonate with you. Greece has now extended voting rights to the diaspora. or at least after a lot of discussion, these people are not interested in voting. They're interested in traveling and perhaps even retiring in Greece, spending like more than 3 months there. In a way, they're eager to go and spend their money in Greece. I mean, what more can you wish? But they really hope that now that they've reached retirement and can take their children and grandchildren, that they would be given, if not a connection to a family, at least a reconnecting with their culture, and Greek citizenship would make that a whole lot easier. So this is what I have for you, and I hope and I welcome a lot of your questions. Thank you.
Fascinating talk, Gonda.
We did this.
Right now, questions on chat. Also, yeah, okay. But I'm going to start now with a few comments. I have actually met a couple of people that belong to your category. The first one of those adopted to the family would be my uncle Vangelis, through whom I eventually got U.S. citizenship myself. His family was killed in the Civil War. He did come in the area and was adopted by a faraway family member here in the U.S. The second case was a girl that when I was at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, I was out at TOS with other Greek friends. And it was summer, and we were talking in Greek. And a girl comes to us, and she says, you know, my late grandfather was actually adopted from Greece, and she tried to find out more. But unfortunately, apparently her grandfather was not successful. Back in the 90s, the whole story of overseas adoption around the turn of the millennium actually did become a major media thing. And every year, around Christmas and Easter, and they would have some 70-year-olds meeting their brother for the first time in 65 years or something.
Yeah.
And they mentioned a boat by Queen Frederica sent the boat of orphans, an entire boat sent to the United States. And they had also mentioned the Saint Stylianos orphanage in Thessaloniki.
Yeah, that's a local scandal in Greece. That's a local. What happens with this is the history kind of comes up time and again, and then it kind of goes away. But when it comes up via scandal, and then it kind of peters out.
Anyone else have a question? Please unmute yourself. Oh.
It's long time to write it, so I'm just going to voice it over here. So Gonda, we have spoken in the past, and I know that, as you mentioned, DNA testing has really accelerated that urgency for a lot of people to find their roots and all that. I just want to, and you encourage the Greek people to do that DNA testing, but you're talking to people already living here in the U.S. Is there anything that we can do to propagate that notion to Greece of getting more testing?
It would be ideal if people actually took the initiative themselves to do testing. I'm actually not in favor of taking tests to Greece and bringing them back, because technically that's not legal. You're dealing with somebody else's biogenetic material. There are huge privacy issues involved. But actually getting the word out it seems like every extended Greek family has something to do with adoption. Getting the word out that it would be a good thing for, let's say, the older members of the family to do a DNA test, which will serve you one way or another, or as your children take an interest in genealogy. Some of you take a very vivid interest in genealogy. The thing that people who kind of have a passion for genealogy come to regret is that they never ask the older generation to take a test. So if you can kind of help add to the pool, but on your own initiative, and in the confidence relationship that you establish with your relatives, that would be a wonderful asset. That would be a wonderful asset indeed. But there are issues involved. People have severe concerns about what this material is used for, right? That is. So I'm a little hesitant, because some of these countries, like France, for instance, have actually, for the longest time, you still cannot order a DNA test in France. So clearly some countries haven't figured out the privacy rules around it, but some sort of a greater awareness in a smaller family circle. If you trust it yourself, that would certainly do a lot of good.
If anyone else has a question, please unmute yourself.
I have a question. Is there any documentation of what happened and how these people that came to America because by adoption, what happened to their lives and stories afterwards? Where are they? What they do?
They are everywhere. They're everywhere. You know, there are many of them in New York. A big contingent of them in San Diego. There's somebody in Fresno, I know. In Chicago. They're absolutely everywhere. Some have actually left the States and lived someplace else, but they're literally all over the States, and Alaska, and Hawaii, and the Philippines, and Europe. They're everywhere. And they do, a whole lot of them are, and this is actually quite striking, a whole lot of them are in education. A whole lot of them are teachers, would you believe it? They have their own families, they have a lot of questions, their children have questions, but most of them are just very good contributing members of society in roles that are critical to society, like a lot of them are in healthcare and education. So I find that very, very important, that there's definitely a sense of giving back. But they all have this kind of, you know, no matter how well it went, there is always that hole of the not knowing where you came from and how you were set on that path. And if anybody is still out there thinking of you or perhaps regretting a decision and what your life could have been, and could you ever reconnect? Do you have had siblings, for instance? A whole lot of these children were given up because their mother was very young and unmarried, and in Greece in the 1950s, that was a huge problem, right? Young and unmarried, that was very shameful for the family. So the young woman gives up the child, and then very often, very often that's very traumatic. And when you meet them, when the mother is now, let's say, 85, there's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of pain there, because what happened is in the 1950s it was shameful. But look at society now, and the woman understands that if it happened now, nobody would blink, right? So you could have held on to your child if the times were right, but they weren't. And so there's a lot of pain there. And then very often the woman remarried and has other children, which means that these people have had siblings.
There are two comments on the chat. The first is by Evangeline. She says, thank you for this presentation, raising the awareness of the older generation, much appreciated. And the second one is from Nick Webb. Thank you, Gonda, for sharing our story. Now, J.P. Kopoulos just added a question. What was the population of Greece in the 1950s?
The population of Greece in the 1950s is just over 7 million. Like 7.5 million. But here's the painful part for Greece. So they lost so many children to the pedomazoma. They lost so many children to the pedopolis. They lost so many people in the war. In the 1950s, Greece is bleeding people who leave for Germany, Belgium, Sweden, you name it. And then also 3,000 lost to adoption. This is just a huge depletion of the country. This is really, think of it on a devastating scale, how rapidly people were leaving Greece in the 1950s. It's almost as if the population doesn't quite get up to 8 million because there are all these movements away from Greece. And then it stabilizes a little bit in the late 50s and the 60s, and then comes the dictatorship, and then another exodus, this time of the students. And actually right now there is an exodus because of the crisis. And again, so the pain of constantly losing some of its youngest and strongest forces is actually quite an ethnic tragedy if you think of it. And here you all are, right? Expats in another country. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that when the scandal in the late 90s came out, my uncle Elias was saying that back in the 40s, to be accepted in an orphanage, you needed to have political connections. It was that bad.
Yes, yes.
And does anyone else have comments?
I just want to say hi to Nick Webb, who is one of my most faithful followers.
Let me follow up.
I want to emphasize to you, so when we think of this group today, don't think of them as Greek Americans. That's only a small portion of them. There are, the people in Utah. There's a huge contingent of people who were taken in by Jewish couples. So they are Jewish, military couples, Baptists, you name it, the whole range.
I had a follow-up question to your comment. You identified 3,200 adopted babies from immigration records. So that was the legal way you were, scoring the ship's manifest and the airplane manifest, whatever. And you found 3,200 people, right? I've heard elsewhere, maybe you can share the story. How many of those have been identified either by you or other organizations or records?
Look, until now, this is a private initiative. Greece has no records. Greece never kept a list. Greece has no idea at this point, which is mind-boggling to me. But if they want to make a list, I'm eager to help them. I'm hoping that one day they start looking at it seriously. What has already happened? People who were born in the 1940s, we've already lost a good number of them. So a good number of them have died. A good number of them have emigrated to yet other countries. Some people are in Canada, in other. Some people are not interested in looking. But then the majority is looking, and they are very active on Facebook and in groups, and they make themselves known. And there are a few among us right now. So they make themselves known. So it's actually. So you can confirm the numbers by the fact that these people don't hide that. They're so eager to find answers that they put themselves out there with their story, saying, if anybody can make a connection, please help,
Okay, so J.P. Kopoulos is asking, how about orphans to Canada? I guess, have you investigated that?
Ultimately to Canada, very few. Very often, the Netherlands are the second biggest taker. The third biggest taker, another country I didn't expect, is Sweden. And after that, you get Canada and Australia, but they fall behind. If people ended up in Canada, it's because it was their own initiative to move there at some point.
Does anybody else have a question?
Well, let's bring it back to our own organization. Gonda, of course, put that in significant and, major play in all that. I was wondering if there is anything on our end that we can do to help out the cause, either by records or talking to, lifetime members that were involved in there or something. Is it a possibility?
I know that there is a big drive going on to collect archives that may be in private possession. I would hope that continues, and I would hope that if somebody starts scanning these, or if they come upon what is like a cache of letters related to adoptions, please forward them to people who know what they're looking at, because they can contain answers for people, and it is important. And it is not too late yet. That's the point. People want to know their history, and they want to find siblings. They're realistic about their options that they may not find a birth mother. They know that. They get that. But there's still that hope that they may find family members. And for that, it's not too late yet. So if people can look with a keen eye at what it is they have, not throw out anything, condense it, and then ask people who can put this in a context to look at it. And that's kind of on a local scale. But then I'm hoping also that the national organization, especially now that they hope to meet in Athens because of the bicentenary, with the convention in Athens, I hope that this can somehow become a conversation topic. That the AHEPA can understand that, okay, it's a big organization, a few things go wrong, as it always happens in organizations, but I always like it. The AHEPA members were very vocal when they sensed things were going on. They let their voices be heard. Oh my, they didn't, they speak up, and they wrote it. They wrote it in some pretty clear language, let's say. But look, in the end, you don't turn the clock back 60 years, right? But if the AHEPA can, in a way, kind of lend its support to a movement for greater awareness, citizenship, acknowledging that this is a key part of AHEPA history of the 50s, and that its AHEPA members would be on the lookout for sources or for stories of how, maybe their fathers were involved or so, that could secure a breakthrough. I actually approached the wife of the Greek lawyer that worked for the AHEPA in Athens, and she just kind of casually says, oh no, these documents, I threw them out a long time ago. They're not of any use for anybody. What's the point of holding on to them?
Evangelina, is it true that Greece doesn't allow adoptions outside of Greece? Now, I can't even answer that. That is not true, because we have had cases in Greece, and I've had classmates in Greece who were adopted from outside Greece. But if you wish to answer it.
Today, Greeks adopt from other countries. Now they are the ones adopting children rather than sending children out for adoption. And actually, a lot of the adoptions today are Ethiopian children by Greek parents.
Does anybody else have a question?
I have a comment here, and a question to Professor Gonda. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very informative, and will incentivize our members to that direction. We, as AHEPA, we have a big membership decline issue, and there is no reason. I mean, I see here one opportunity to extend our hand to all these, I'll call them now Philellin, who are seeking their identity. I see and confirm to me an opportunity. I'm working with Vasily on LinkedIn and our social media, Facebook, where we have to admit we are behind. I think with the technology nowadays, through social media, we can reach and find all these folks and bring them close to us and share our culture. How do you see that nowadays, using especially social media?
I would, for instance, I mean, if the AHEPA can make a breakthrough with collecting the local archives, and if it can start devoting resources to digitizing the most important one, I think that would be fascinating. It would help the adoptees and the adoption history, but it would also paint so much richer a picture of the history of the AHEPA. I think it's an important chapter. I've already been talking with Alexander Kitroev. Alexander Kitroev has the task of writing the history of the AHEPA on the occasion of the 100th anniversary, which will be next year. And you remember well that in 1972, Labor is his name, brought out a book on the 50th anniversary of the AHEPA. But the thing is, he does not mention the adoptions, because by that time, people were still kind of up in arms about what had gone wrong, and he does not mention the adoption. He posts a few pictures, but he stays clear from the adoption. And so I'm hoping that at some point there will be enough openness to kind of incorporate this history and come clear about it, and then try to make efforts to kind of give a more collective voice. I had also approached the organizers of the conference in Athens over the summer, because they have an events program, and I had volunteered that I would like to talk to them. And I can do it in Greek if I have to, I don't mind. I have given the same lecture in Greek, so that's not a problem. But I never heard back. So, but my offer still stands. If they want a speaker on the program talking about AHEPA history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I am available.
Thank you. You start the snowball. The way I see it is going to accelerate. It takes time. It's a very sensitive issue.
It is.
Everyone knows. Our family, we know a person who is seeking her parents, and she also got stuck in the dilemma: what if she finds her natural parents? How is going to get with her adopted parents.
But you know, there is no reason. I mean, the parents that raised you are your parents, right? But the parents that you may find, or the siblings, help you fill out an important component of your identity. And it's good to know your story. It's not a matter of loyalties. It's a matter of getting some basic answers, because loyalties have already been decided. If a relationship was good, it will continue to be good with the adoptive parent. If it's not, then it was already on the rocks, right? I mean,
Yes.
It will not shake up, it will not set the clock back on anything if that wasn't already in the cards. That's my experience. But knowing where you come from and kind of filling out the puzzle and finally understanding why it happened, it's hugely important. And it's more important as people get older. It preoccupies them more as they get older. They can kind of leave it alone during their active years when they're working and changing jobs and moving and raising children. But once they hit 60s, and now with COVID, it preoccupies them. And it's not a coincidence that with COVID, the interest in genealogy and DNA tests has kind of peaked. And we ask ourselves questions about our elderly relatives and our own immune system. And all of a sudden you see like 27,000 people interacting on Facebook on genealogical questions, Greek genealogical questions, every single day. It's an obsession. And so not knowing becomes your quest, right? You want objective answers. You don't look for new sentimentalities or anything. You just kind of finally want the question marks answered. And that's a very logical question. I want to remind you of something. The first thing Greeks ask Greeks when they meet each other is, "Από πού είστε?" "Από πού είστε?" I get that all the time. So imagine never being able to answer that question. It's the most basic, the most common Greek question, and you, for being Greek, don't have the answer.
That's true. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If there aren't any other questions, let us thank again our speaker, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.